October 1943. The Philadelphia Naval Shipyard sits shrouded in the peculiar silence that descends on military installations after dark. But on this autumn evening, according to a story that would haunt the American imagination for decades to come, something extraordinary is about to unfold along the Delaware River waterfront. Picture, if you will, the USS Eldridge, a destroyer escort, hull number 1730, moored to the pier and bristling with equipment that has no business being on a naval warship. Thick cables snake across her deck, connecting generators that hum with an intensity that makes the air itself feel electric. Sailors move nervously among the machinery, their faces betraying an uncertainty about what they have been ordered to do. Then it begins. The generators surge. A greenish fog materializes around the hull, spreading outward like something alive, something aware. Witnesses will later claim the mist possessed an otherworldly quality, luminescent and thick, crawling across the water's surface with purpose. Within moments, the destroyer begins to shimmer. The sharp lines of her hull soften, become translucent, then fade entirely from view. Where a warship once floated, now exists only empty water and that impossible green haze. But the story does not end with invisibility. According to the legend that would emerge a decade later, the USS Eldridge did not simply vanish from sight. She vanished from Philadelphia entirely, materializing hundreds of miles away in Norfolk, Virginia, before returning to her original position. And when she reappeared, the crew had paid a terrible price. Some sailors were said to be fused into the metal bulkheads, their bodies merged with the ship's structure in ways that defied explanation. Others had gone mad, their minds shattered by whatever impossible journey they had taken. Still others had allegedly vanished completely, never to be seen again. This is the Philadelphia experiment, a tale that bridges the gap between military conspiracy and science fiction, between classified wartime research and pure mythology. For more than 70 years, it has captivated believers and skeptics alike, spawning books, documentaries, and Hollywood films. But where did this story come from? And more importantly, why has it endured when so many other conspiracy theories have faded into obscurity? The answers begin not in 1943, but in 1955, when a writer and amateur astronomer named Morris Ketchum Jessup received a series of bizarre letters from a merchant seaman who called himself Carlos Miguel Allende, sometimes signing his name as Carl Allen. These rambling cryptic messages would transform an obscure claim about naval experiments into one of the most persistent legends in American folklore. In the summer of 1955, astronomer Morris K. Jessup received a letter that would change the trajectory of his life and, some believe, ultimately lead to his mysterious death. The envelope bore no return address, only a postmark from a small town in Pennsylvania. Inside, scrawled across the pages in handwriting that shifted from careful block letters to wild, looping script, was one of the most bizarre communications ever sent to a man of science. The letter was signed by Carlos Miguel Allende, though he sometimes called himself Carl Meredith Allen, and sometimes simply Carl Allen, as if even his own identity remained uncertain in his mind. Jessup was no stranger to unusual correspondence. As the author of The Case for the UFO, published just a year earlier, he had become a magnet for letters from people convinced they possessed secret knowledge about extraterrestrial visitors and government cover-ups. But the Allende letters stood apart from the typical UFO enthusiast mail that crossed his desk. These were different. These contained specific details, exact dates, and vivid descriptions of an experiment so fantastic, so horrifying in its implications, that Jessup found himself unable to simply file them away and forget them. The first letter arrived in January of 1956, though Allende dated his recollections to October of 1943. His handwriting alone was enough to give pause to anyone who examined it. The text wandered across the page in multiple ink colors, blue bleeding into green, then black, then back to blue again, as if Allende had been writing over the course of hours or days, picking up whatever pen was closest at hand. Some words were underlined 3 or 4 times for emphasis. Others were written in capitals that seemed to scream from the page. Sentences trailed off into ellipses, only to resume paragraphs later with fragmented thoughts that may or may not have connected to what came before. Allende claimed to have been a merchant mariner serving aboard the SS Andrew Furuseth, a Liberty ship, during World War II. According to his account, in October of 1943, his vessel had been docked in the Philadelphia Naval shipyard. It was there, he insisted, that he witnessed something the government had desperately tried to keep hidden, an experiment in invisibility conducted on a destroyer escort designated to 173, the USS Eldridge. The experiment, Allende wrote, was based on the unified field theory, the grand unification of physics that Albert Einstein had been working toward for years. Navy scientists had supposedly discovered a practical application for these theoretical principles, a way to bend light and radar waves around a ship, rendering it invisible to enemy detection. But what happened, according to Allende's frantic scrawl, went far beyond anything the scientists had anticipated. He described watching from the deck of the Andrew Fruzeth as the Eldridge began to glow with a greenish fog. The mist grew thicker and thicker until the entire ship was enveloped in what Allende called a terrible green light. Then, in an instant that seemed to tear at the fabric of reality itself, the Eldridge vanished. Not just from sight, Allende claimed, but from Philadelphia entirely. According to his account, the destroyer materialized hundreds of miles away in Norfolk, Virginia, remained visible there for several minutes, then returned to the Philadelphia shipyard in another blinding flash of green light. But the teleportation, as impossible as it sounded, was not the most disturbing part of Allende's testimony. It was what happened to the crew that filled his letters with a palpable sense of horror and regret. The sailors aboard the Eldridge, he wrote, had been subjected to forces that human beings were never meant to endure. The effects on their bodies and minds were catastrophic. Some men, Allende claimed, were found fused into the metal structure of the ship itself. He described sailors whose bodies had merged with the steel bulkheads, their molecules somehow intermingled with the destroyer's hull during the teleportation process. These men, he wrote with apparent anguish, were still alive when discovered, screaming in agony as Navy personnel tried desperately to separate flesh from metal. The attempts at rescue, according to Allende, were ultimately futile. The men died in unspeakable pain, their bodies literally part of the ship they had served upon. Others, he wrote, suffered fates that might have been even worse. Several crew members became stuck in what Allende called the freeze. These sailors had apparently become caught between states of visibility and invisibility, their bodies partially phased out of normal reality. They would suddenly freeze in place, becoming immobile and invisible to those around them. Fellow crew members learned to help them by placing their hands on the frozen sailor's shoulders and walking in a specific pattern, a technique that somehow brought the affected man back to full visibility and mobility. But this only worked if the intervention came quickly. If a sailor remained in the freeze for too long, Allende suggested, he might never come back. The psychological effects were equally devastating. Allende wrote of men who went completely insane, their minds shattered by the experience of being torn out of normal space and time. He described sailors who became violent, attacking their shipmates without warning or provocation. Others withdrew into catatonic states, staring at nothing, responding to no one, trapped in whatever horrors they had witnessed during those moments of invisibility. Some crew members, according to Allende's increasingly agitated handwriting, developed the ability to become invisible at will, though this was far from a blessing. He described incidents in bars and on the streets where sailors from the Eldridge would suddenly vanish in front of civilian witnesses. These spontaneous disappearances, he claimed, caused panic among the affected sailors and anyone who happened to be nearby. The Navy, desperate to contain the situation, allegedly discharged these men on psychiatric grounds and worked to discredit any witnesses who came forward with stories about disappearing sailors. Allende provided specific details that lent his account an unsettling air of authenticity. He named the lead scientist as Dr. Franklin Reno, who he claimed was conducting research based on Einstein's theories. He mentioned specific dates in October of 1943. He described the exact appearance of the green fog and the sequence of events during the experiment. His letters contained technical terminology mixed with his rambling stream of consciousness style, creating a document that read like the testimony of someone who had witnessed something real but lacked the scientific vocabulary to describe it properly. Morris Jessup, despite his scientific training and natural skepticism, found himself drawn into the mystery. Here was a man claiming to have witnessed an experiment that would revolutionize physics if true, an experiment that suggested the government had not only achieved practical application of unified field theory, but had done so during World War II, years ahead of what mainstream science considered possible. Jessup wrote back to Allende, asking for more details, for corroboration, for anything that could verify the extraordinary claims. Allende's second letter was even more disturbing than the first. The handwriting had deteriorated further, the multiple ink colors creating an almost psychedelic effect on the page. He seemed angry that Jessup had asked for proof, insisting that the astronomer should be grateful for the information rather than demanding evidence. He wrote that he could not provide the names of other witnesses because to do so would put them in danger. The Navy, he claimed, had gone to great lengths to silence anyone connected with the Philadelphia experiment, and he feared for his own safety, simply for having contacted Jessup at all. Then came a twist that elevated the mystery to an even stranger level. In the spring of 1957, Jessup was contacted by the Office of Naval Research. Two officers wanted to meet with him regarding a peculiar package they had received. Someone had mailed the ONR a copy of Jessup's book, The Case for the UFO, but this was no ordinary copy. The margins of every page were filled with handwritten annotations in 3 different colors of ink, extensive notes that seemed to be written by multiple people, discussing UFOs as if they had intimate knowledge of their construction and operation. The annotations referenced the Allende Letters and made cryptic comments about the Philadelphia experiment. The Navy officers wanted Jessup to examine these annotations and provide his assessment. When he saw the book, Jessup immediately recognized elements of Allende's writing style in at least one of the 3 annotating hands. But who were the other annotators? Were they real, or was this an elaborate hoax created by one disturbed individual? The Office of Naval Research took the annotated book seriously enough to create a limited run of reproduced copies using the Varro Manufacturing Company's printing facilities, a decision that conspiracy theorists would later point to as evidence that the Navy knew more about the Philadelphia experiment than they were admitting. Jessup became increasingly obsessed with unraveling the mystery. He devoted more and more time to investigating Allende's claims, trying to track down the elusive merchant mariner, searching for any shred of evidence that the experiment had actually occurred. Friends and colleagues noticed a change in him. He became withdrawn, preoccupied, speaking in vague terms about dangerous knowledge and forces that should not be tampered with. On the evening of April 20th, 1959, Morris K. Jessup was found dead in his car in Dade County, Florida. The vehicle was parked near his home, the engine still running, a hose leading from the exhaust pipe into the passenger compartment. The official ruling was suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning. He was just 59 years old. But the circumstances surrounding his death immediately sparked questions that persist to this day. Jessup had been scheduled to meet with a colleague that evening to discuss new research. Friends insisted he had shown no signs of suicidal depression. Some witnesses claimed they saw another car near Jessup's vehicle that evening, though these reports were never officially confirmed. Most puzzling of all, Jessup had allegedly told close associates that he was on the verge of a breakthrough regarding the Philadelphia experiment, that he was finally beginning to piece together what had really happened. Conspiracy theorists seized upon these details as evidence that Jessup had been murdered, silenced by government agents who could not allow him to reveal what he had learned. Others suggested that Jessup had stumbled upon knowledge so disturbing, so fundamentally threatening to his understanding of reality, that he had chosen death over living with what he knew. As for Carlos Allende, he seemed to vanish into obscurity after Jessup's death, surfacing only occasionally over the years with new letters and claims, each as bizarre as the last. When researchers finally tracked him down decades later, he gave conflicting accounts of his original letters, sometimes insisting every word was true, other times admitting to fabrication, then reversing himself again. His mental state appeared to deteriorate over the years, making it impossible to determine where truth ended and delusion began. The Allende Letters remain one of the most perplexing documents in the annals of conspiracy theory and fringe science. They are either the ravings of a disturbed mind, an elaborate hoax, or the testimony of a man who witnessed something so extraordinary that it broke conventional reality. And somewhere between those faded pages with their multiple ink colors and increasingly frantic handwriting lies a question that refuses to be answered. What did Morris Jessup discover that led him to that parked car on a warm Florida evening? And what truth, if any, was Carlos Allende trying so desperately to communicate from across the years? The men who supposedly served aboard the USS Eldridge during that fateful October experiment in 1943 never asked to become living nightmares. They were ordinary sailors, boys from farms and small towns across America, who had enlisted to serve their country during wartime. What allegedly happened to them in the years that followed would transform them into something else entirely, creatures caught between worlds, neither fully present in our reality nor completely absent from it. The first stories began to surface quietly in naval circles, whispered rumors that something had gone catastrophically wrong during a classified experiment in Philadelphia. But it would take decades before the full scope of the horror would emerge, told in fragmented testimonies from family members, supposed witnesses, and men claiming to have served alongside the Eldridge crew. These accounts painted a picture of suffering so profound, so utterly alien to normal human experience, that many dismissed them as impossible fabrications. Yet the details remained consistent across multiple sources who seemingly had no contact with one another, each describing the same impossible phenomena. The most immediate effect reported by those who claimed knowledge of the aftermath was what became known as the freeze. According to these accounts, crew members who had been exposed to the electromagnetic fields during the experiment found themselves slipping out of phase with normal reality. It would happen without warning, often in public places where the victims had sought some semblance of normal life. A sailor might be sitting in a bar, drinking beer with fellow servicemen, trying to forget whatever he had witnessed aboard that ship. Then, mid-conversation, he would begin to fade. Not disappear entirely, but become translucent, his features growing indistinct as though he were transforming into living glass. Witnesses described the terror in these men's eyes as they realized what was happening. They would look down at their own hands and see through them to the floor beneath. They could still see the world around them, could still hear the conversations continuing nearby, but they could no longer interact with physical reality. Their voices would fade to whispers, then silence, and they would freeze, locked in position, unable to move or cry out, trapped in this half-state between visibility and complete invisibility. Some reports claimed these episodes lasted minutes. Others suggested hours or even days. The most detailed account of this phenomenon came from a Philadelphia bartender who allegedly witnessed such an event in late 1943. He described serving drinks to a group of young sailors one evening when one of the men suddenly stopped moving mid-sentence. The bartender watched as the sailor's face contorted in silent horror, his body becoming increasingly transparent until he resembled a ghost. The other sailors at the table went pale, as though they had seen this before. They formed a protective circle around their frozen companion, preventing other patrons from getting too close. One of them pulled out what the bartender described as a small metallic device and held it near the frozen sailor's chest. After several minutes, the man slowly began to solidify again, color returning to his features, his body regaining substance. When he could move once more, he collapsed across the table, weeping. The bartender claimed he approached the group afterward, asking if he should call for medical help. The sailors looked at him with eyes that he later described as utterly hollow, empty of anything resembling hope. One of them simply said that no doctor could help their friend, that what was wrong with him existed beyond the reach of conventional medicine. They paid their tab and left, supporting their still trembling companion between them. The bartender said he never forgot the sight of that young man fading from reality, never forgot the absolute despair in the faces of those who had tried to save him. But the freeze, as horrifying as it was, represented only one category of the alleged effects. Other reports described phenomena even more disturbing, violations of physical law that turned the human body itself into something unstable and nightmarish. Multiple sources spoke of spontaneous combustion events, though not in the traditional sense. These were not cases of people suddenly bursting into ordinary flames. According to the testimonies, affected crew members would begin to emit a strange greenish glow from within their bodies, visible through their skin and clothing. The light would intensify over seconds or minutes, growing brighter and brighter until the man would erupt into flames that witnesses described as cold, giving off no heat but consuming flesh nonetheless. One account came from a woman who claimed her husband had served on the Eldridge. She described waking in the middle of the night to find her bedroom bathed in an eerie green light. Her husband was sitting up in bed beside her, his body glowing from within, his face frozen in terror. She said she could see the light moving through his veins like liquid electricity, pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. He tried to speak but could only manage a whisper, telling her to run, to get away from him. Before she could move, the green light erupted outward and his body caught fire. She described the flames as appearing almost black in the darkness, cold to the touch when she tried desperately to smother them. Within moments her husband was gone, reduced to ash that glowed faintly green in the darkness. Medical personnel at naval hospitals allegedly documented similar cases, though all such records have supposedly been lost or classified beyond retrieval. Doctors claimed they had no framework for understanding what they were seeing. The burns, when they could be examined on survivors, showed cellular damage at a level that defied conventional understanding. The tissue had been altered at a molecular level, as though the very structure of the men's bodies had been fundamentally changed. Then there were the stories of what some called the ghost sailors, men who had allegedly developed the ability to pass through solid matter. Unlike the freeze, which seemed to happen involuntarily and left its victims trapped and helpless, this phenomenon appeared to be a persistent condition. According to multiple testimonies, certain crew members from the Eldridge could no longer maintain a stable relationship with physical objects. They would sink through chairs when trying to sit, fall through floors, pass through walls without meaning to. Their bodies had become unstable, unable to remain fully solid. A particularly haunting account described a young sailor who returned home to his family in rural Pennsylvania after being discharged from the Navy in late 1943. His mother reported that he seemed different, distant, and frightened, jumping at shadows and refusing to sleep in a bed. When pressed, he admitted that he could no longer trust solid objects to hold him. He slept on the floor because twice he had woken to find himself sinking through his mattress, passing through the bed frame and into the space beneath. He ate standing up because he had fallen through chairs at the dinner table. His parents watched in horror as their son gradually lost the ability to interact with the physical world. He began spending most of his time outdoors, standing on bare earth, which seemed to be the only surface that reliably supported him. Within months, he disappeared entirely. His mother claimed he had simply faded away one morning, becoming more and more transparent until he vanished completely, his final expression one of relief. The most famous single incident, the one that has been repeated in numerous accounts of the Philadelphia experiment, allegedly occurred at a sailor's bar near the Philadelphia Naval Yard in 1943. According to the story, two sailors walked into the establishment one evening and became involved in an altercation with other patrons. As the fight escalated and military police were called, witnesses claimed both sailors suddenly vanished in full view of dozens of people. They didn't run away or hide. They simply became invisible where they stood, their bodies fading from sight while their voices could still be heard, cursing and protesting their innocence. The military police who arrived on the scene allegedly questioned everyone present, taking detailed statements from witnesses who all corroborated the same impossible story. The two sailors had been visible one moment and completely gone the next, though their voices continued for several seconds after they disappeared, shouting that they didn't want to go back, that they couldn't take it anymore. Some witnesses claimed they could hear footsteps moving toward the door, could hear the door open and close, though no one could see who was operating it. The military police supposedly filed a report on the incident, though like so much documentation related to the Eldridge, that report has never been located in official archives. Family members of alleged Eldridge crew members told stories of men who returned from service fundamentally broken, not by conventional combat trauma but by something that had reached into them and scrambled the very nature of their existence. These were men who could no longer tolerate being in enclosed spaces because the walls would sometimes cease to be solid barriers. Men who wore gloves constantly because their hands would occasionally become transparent, and the sight of their own skeletal structure, visible through vanishing flesh, drove them to despair. Men who kept detailed journals documenting their episodes of instability, desperate attempts to find patterns or triggers that might help them maintain some control over their disintegrating relationship with reality. One such journal, allegedly belonging to a crew member named Michael, described in agonizing detail the progression of his condition over several months. Early entries spoke of occasional episodes of feeling weightless, of momentarily seeing through his own hands. Later entries became more frantic, describing longer and longer periods of partial invisibility, times when he could see and hear but could not make himself seen or heard by others. His final entries spoke of a growing certainty that he was losing his grip on this world entirely, that he was being pulled toward somewhere else, some other dimension or state of being where the laws of physics operated differently. The journal ended mid-sentence, the final words reading, "I can feel it pulling at me now, stronger than before, and I don't think I can hold on any longer. I can see the other place, and it's full of..." The accounts from supposed witnesses and family members built a consistent picture of men trapped in a nightmare of their own government's making, subjected to forces they could not understand or control, transformed into living evidence of humanity's reckless experimentation with powers beyond our comprehension. Whether these stories represent genuine testimony or elaborate folklore, they speak to a deep-seated fear of technology advancing faster than our ability to predict or contain its consequences. They remind us that every scientific breakthrough carries the potential for disaster, that the line between progress and catastrophe can be terrifyingly thin. These men, real or imagined, became symbols of the human cost of unchecked experimentation, their suffering a warning that some doors should perhaps remain closed, some mysteries left unsolved, lest we unleash forces that reduce human beings to ghosts, haunting the margins between worlds. In the gray waters of the Atlantic Ocean during the early years of World War II, naval commanders faced an invisible killer that was decimating Allied shipping lanes. Magnetic mines, resting silently on the ocean floor, waited for the distinctive magnetic signature of steel-hulled vessels passing overhead. These weapons didn't require direct contact. They simply detected the distortion in Earth's magnetic field created by thousands of tons of metal moving through the water, and then detonated with devastating effect. By 1940, the problem had reached crisis proportions. Ships were going down at an alarming rate, and the Allies desperately needed a solution to this silent threat lurking beneath the waves. The answer came not from some exotic theoretical physics experiment, but from practical electromagnetic engineering. Scientists and naval engineers developed a technique called degaussing, named after the unit of magnetic field strength, the Gauss. The principle was elegantly simple, even if the execution proved complex. By wrapping the hull of a ship with large electrical cables and running a carefully calibrated current through them, they could create an electromagnetic field that counteracted the ship's natural magnetic signature. The vessel would effectively become magnetically invisible to the mines below, passing overhead without triggering their sensors. The implementation of degaussing technology required meticulous work. Engineers had to map the unique magnetic signature of each ship class, sometimes each individual vessel, and then design a specific cable configuration to neutralize it. Thick electrical cables were wound around the hull in precise patterns, running along the length of the ship at calculated intervals. When energized, these cables produced a magnetic field that was essentially the inverse of the ship's own field. The two fields canceled each other out, creating what was known as a degaussed state. Ships entering and leaving port would pass through degaussing stations where their magnetic signatures were measured and their systems adjusted. It was painstaking, technical work, but it saved countless lives and vessels. The United States Navy established degaussing facilities at naval bases across the country and around the world. The Philadelphia Naval Shipyard became one of the major centers for this work, handling hundreds of vessels throughout the war. Ships would be brought in, their hulls would be wrapped with the necessary cabling, and extensive testing would be conducted to ensure the system was working properly. This was real science, real electromagnetic manipulation, and it was happening on a massive scale. Sailors could walk past these vessels and see the thick cables running along the hulls, witness the testing procedures, observe the technical discussions among engineers. It was all very visible, very public, and absolutely crucial to the war effort. But here's where reality begins to blur into legend. The presence of all this electromagnetic equipment, the secrecy surrounding certain aspects of naval operations, and the general atmosphere of wartime innovation create fertile ground for speculation. Sailors talked. Rumors spread. And when you have ships wrapped in electrical cables undergoing mysterious technical procedures, the human imagination begins to fill in the gaps with something far more dramatic than magnetic mind countermeasures. Enter Albert Einstein, whose name by the 1940s had become synonymous with revolutionary physics and almost magical scientific achievement. Einstein had been working, both publicly and privately, on what he called a unified field theory. This was his attempt to create a single theoretical framework that would unite electromagnetism and gravity, two fundamental forces of nature that appeared to operate under completely different rules. He had published various papers on the subject throughout the 1930s and into the 40s, and the scientific community was well aware of his efforts, even if they didn't fully understand or accept his approach. The unified field theory was deeply mathematical and highly abstract. Einstein was attempting to describe the fundamental structure of space-time itself, to find the underlying geometry that would explain both how masses attract each other through gravity and how charged particles interact through electromagnetic forces. It was theoretical physics at its most esoteric, dealing with equations and mathematical spaces that had no immediate practical application. But to the public, and certainly to those inclined toward sensational interpretation, the phrase unified field theory sounded like something that could do almost anything. If you could unify the forces of nature, what else might become possible? Einstein did have connections to the military during World War II. He consulted on various projects, offered his expertise when asked, and was certainly no stranger to the Navy Department. But his contributions were typically in areas relating to explosives and other conventional military applications of physics. There is no credible evidence that he ever worked on any project attempting to make ships invisible, either to radar or to the human eye. Yet the coincidence of his presence, his work on field theories, and the Navy's very real electromagnetic experiments created a perfect storm of circumstantial connections that would later be woven into the Philadelphia experiment mythology. Then there's Nikola Tesla, a figure who had already achieved almost mythical status during his own lifetime. Tesla's legitimate contributions to electrical engineering were extraordinary. He had pioneered alternating current systems, experimented with wireless power transmission, and explored high-voltage, high-frequency electrical phenomena that produced spectacular visual effects. His laboratory demonstrations featured enormous electrical arcs, glowing coronas, and crackling discharges that seemed almost supernatural to observers. Tesla had also made various claims throughout his career about death rays, earthquake machines, and other inventions that stretched credibility, though he insisted they were all based on sound scientific principles. Tesla died in New York City on January 7, 1943, alone in a hotel room, many of his later ideas unrealized, and some of his papers still unpublished. The timing was significant. The Philadelphia experiment was allegedly supposed to have occurred later that same year, in October of 1943. Immediately after Tesla's death, there was speculation about what might have been found in his papers, what secret knowledge might have died with him, or conversely, what secrets might have been seized by government agents who reportedly visited his room. This speculation was never supported by solid evidence, but it didn't need to be. Tesla's death became another ingredient in the growing legend, another mysterious element that could be stirred into the narrative. The idea that Tesla's electromagnetic research might have contributed to some secret Navy invisibility experiment is based more on the dramatic appeal of the connection than on any documentary evidence. Tesla had indeed experimented with electromagnetic fields and their effects on various materials, but there's a vast gulf between laboratory demonstrations and the kind of large-scale field manipulation that would be required to render a ship invisible. Yet the human mind loves to connect dots, especially when those dots involve legendary scientists and secret military projects. Now let's address the actual physics and technology of the era, because this is where the legend truly diverges from reality. There are two distinct types of invisibility that get conflated in the Philadelphia experiment story: radar invisibility and optical invisibility. These are fundamentally different challenges requiring completely different approaches. Radar invisibility, what we now call stealth technology, is based on manipulating how electromagnetic waves in the radio frequency spectrum interact with an object's surface. Radar works by sending out radio waves and detecting the echoes that bounce back from objects. To make something invisible to radar, you need to either absorb those waves or deflect them in directions away from the receiver. This can be achieved through careful shaping of the object's surface and through the use of special materials that absorb radio frequencies rather than reflecting them. The principles were theoretically understood in the 1940s, but the materials science and computational capabilities needed to implement them effectively didn't exist yet. Modern stealth aircraft are the result of decades of research and development that began in earnest only in the 1970s. Optical invisibility, making something invisible to the human eye, is an entirely different and far more challenging problem. Light behaves differently than radio waves at a practical level, and the wavelengths involved are much, much shorter. To bend visible light around an object so that it appears transparent or invisible requires manipulating the refractive properties of the space around that object in ways that were purely theoretical in the 40s. Modern research into metamaterials and cloaking devices has achieved extremely limited success under highly controlled laboratory conditions and only for very small objects. The idea of cloaking an entire ship in 1943 is not just improbable, but physically absurd given the technology and theoretical understanding of the time. The electromagnetic fields generated by degaussing equipment, while measurable and significant for their intended purpose, were nowhere near powerful enough to affect the propagation of light in any meaningful way. These fields were designed to cancel out magnetic signatures, not to warp spacetime or bend light rays. The energy requirements alone for the kind of field manipulation described in the Philadelphia experiment legend would have been astronomical, far beyond what any ship-based power system of that era could have provided. Yet, here's the fascinating aspect of how the legend developed. Just enough real science existed to make the story sound plausible to the non-expert. Ships really were being wrapped with electrical cables. The Navy really was conducting electromagnetic experiments. Einstein really had worked on field theories. Tesla really had explored bizarre electromagnetic phenomena. Each of these true elements could be taken out of context and reassembled into a narrative that seemed to have the weight of reality behind it, even as it departed entirely from what actually happened. The theoretical physics of the 1940s included some speculative ideas about the nature of electromagnetism and spacetime, but none of it suggested that invisibility was achievable with anything resembling contemporary technology. Einstein's equations were concerned with the fundamental structure of the universe, not with practical applications for military hardware. The gap between theoretical physics and engineering application is often vast, sometimes spanning decades or even centuries. The Philadelphia experiment legend essentially collapses that gap to zero, imagining that cutting-edge theoretical physics could be immediately translated into working technology aboard a naval vessel. What we're left with is a perfect case study in how real wartime technology, when shrouded in the natural secrecy of military operations and filtered through human fascination with the mysterious, can transform into something far more extraordinary than the already impressive reality. Degaussing saved ships and lives through clever application of electromagnetic principles. That should have been story enough, but the human appetite for wonder demanded something more. The United States Navy has maintained the same position for over 70 years. No invisibility experiment. No teleportation event. No electromagnetic disaster aboard the USS Eldridge. According to official military records, the entire Philadelphia experiment never happened. When Carlos Allende's bizarre letters first surfaced in the 1950s, the Office of Naval Research conducted an internal investigation. Their response was clear and unambiguous. The claims were completely without merit. There had been no Project Rainbow involving invisibility experiments. The USS Eldridge had never been subjected to electromagnetic field testing. And most significantly, the ship's deck logs showed that the destroyer escort was nowhere near Philadelphia in October of 1943. The deck logs tell a different story than the one whispered in conspiracy circles. Throughout the autumn of 1943, the USS Eldridge was conducting routine convoy escort duties between New York and North Africa. On the specific dates when witnesses claimed to have seen the ship vanish from the Philadelphia Naval Yard and materialize in Norfolk, Virginia, the Eldridge was actually thousands of miles away in the Atlantic Ocean. The ship's war diary, declassified decades later, meticulously documents its position day by day, hour by hour. There are no gaps in the record, no mysterious blanks, no evidence of doctored entries. Navy officials pointed to a simple case of mistaken identity. The Philadelphia Naval Yard was a massive installation during the Second World War, with dozens of ships coming and going constantly. Perhaps witnesses had confused the Eldridge with another vessel. Perhaps they had misremembered dates or conflated different events. Or perhaps, the Navy suggested diplomatically, the entire story had been fabricated from the beginning. But these denials, no matter how thoroughly documented, have failed to extinguish the legend. If anything, official dismissals have added fuel to the conspiratorial fire. Believers point to the very certainty of the Navy's statements as evidence of a cover-up. After all, they argue, wouldn't the military deny a secret experiment? Isn't that exactly what you would expect them to say? To understand why these denials ring hollow to so many people, we need to examine what the military actually was hiding during this period. The Second World War and the early Cold War years were filled with genuine secret projects, classified operations that seemed impossible, and real conspiracies that were eventually exposed. The public's willingness to believe in the Philadelphia experiment wasn't born from nowhere. It was cultivated by decades of military secrecy and legitimate revelations about projects the government had repeatedly denied. The Manhattan Project stands as the most significant example. Throughout the war years, the United States government spent over $2 billion in 1940s currency developing an atomic weapon. Entire cities were built in secret. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Hanford, Washington sprang up, seemingly overnight, housing tens of thousands of workers who had no idea what they were actually building. The level of compartmentalization was extraordinary. Scientists working on one aspect of uranium enrichment had no knowledge of what was happening in other laboratories. Security was so tight that Vice President Harry Truman himself didn't learn about the atomic bomb project until he became president following Franklin Roosevelt's death. When the bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945, the American public was stunned. The government had developed a weapon that could level entire cities, that could kill 100,000 people in an instant, that could fundamentally alter the nature of warfare itself, and they had done it in complete secrecy. For years, officials had denied rumors about superweapons and mysterious installations. Those denials, it turned out, had been lies. The revelation of the Manhattan Project transformed public understanding of what the military was capable of concealing. If they could hide something that enormous, that world-changing, what else might they be keeping secret? Radar development provided another example of wartime technological secrecy. British and American scientists had made extraordinary advances in radio detection and ranging systems, creating technology that could spot enemy aircraft and ships from dozens of miles away. The effectiveness of radar was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. Elaborate cover stories were created to explain Allied successes. British intelligence spread rumors that their pilots ate enormous quantities of carrots to improve their night vision, anything to distract from the truth about radar-equipped night fighters. Even the term radar itself was classified for years. The public knew something had given the Allies an advantage, but the specifics remained shrouded in official denials and misdirection. Sonar technology followed a similar pattern. Advanced submarine detection systems were developed and deployed in absolute secrecy. The Navy couldn't acknowledge their capabilities without compromising tactical advantages. So when sailors reported strange pinging sounds or unusual equipment aboard destroyers and destroyer escorts like the Eldridge, officials simply stated that no such equipment existed, which was technically true for public consumption, even as that same equipment was being used every day in the Atlantic. This culture of secrecy didn't end when the war did. Operation Paperclip brought the paradigm of official denial into the post-war years with disturbing clarity. As American and Soviet forces advanced through Germany in 1945, both sides scrambled to capture Nazi scientists, engineers, and technical experts. The United States military brought more than 1,600 German scientists to America, many of them former members of the Nazi Party, some with documented involvement in war crime. The public knew nothing about this. When questioned, government officials denied that former Nazis were being given safe haven in the United States. They denied that SS officers were being granted new identities and comfortable positions in American research facilities. They denied that the same scientists who had developed the V-2 rocket, built partly by slave labor from concentration camps, were now working on the American space program. But it was all true. Wernher von Braun, technical director of the Nazi rocket program at Peenemünde, became a central figure in NASA. Arthur Rudolph, operations director of the Mittelwerk factory, where concentration camp prisoners were worked to death building V-2 rockets, received the Distinguished Service Medal from NASA before his past caught up with him decades later. Hubertus Strughold, whose aviation medicine research may have involved experimentation on prisoners at Dachau, became known as the father of space medicine. Operation Paperclip remained classified until the 1970s. For nearly 30 years, official denials masked a truth that would have shocked the American public. The government had brought Nazi scientists to America, given them new backgrounds, and put them to work on classified military and aerospace projects. The conspiracy theorists, as it turned out, hadn't been paranoid enough. These real conspiracies created a fertile environment for belief in the Philadelphia experiment. The public had learned, through bitter experience, that official denials meant nothing. The military would lie about secret projects. They would maintain those lies for decades. They would classify evidence, destroy records, and discredit witnesses. All of this had been proven beyond doubt. So, when the Navy stated unequivocally that the Philadelphia experiment never happened, many people heard an echo of previous denials about atomic weapons and Nazi scientists. They assumed the same pattern was repeating itself. Deny everything. Wait for the witnesses to die. Keep the secrets buried until enough time has passed that revelation no longer matters. The phrase Project Rainbow itself adds another layer of mystery to the official denials. Navy representatives have stated repeatedly that no project by that name involved the USS Eldridge or invisibility experiments. But that specific denial leaves open intriguing possibilities. Was there a Project Rainbow that involved something else? Did the name get attached to the wrong operation through confusion or deliberate misdirection? Declassified documents from the period reveal that Project Rainbow was indeed a real designation, but for something far more mundane than teleportation. Some researchers have identified Project Rainbow as a code name for research into visual camouflage and deception techniques for ships. Not invisibility in the science fiction sense, but practical methods to make vessels harder to spot or identify from a distance. Dazzle camouflage, optical illusions created by paint schemes, smoke generation systems, all of these fell under various research initiatives during the war. Other documents suggest Project Rainbow may have referred to research into countering magnetic mines and torpedoes through degaussing, the process of reducing a ship's magnetic signature. This was genuine cutting-edge technology in the early 1940s. German magnetic mines were sinking Allied ships at an alarming rate. Developing effective countermeasures was a high priority. Degaussing involved running electrical cables around a ship's hull and passing current through them to neutralize the magnetic field. To observers unfamiliar with the technology, the sight of a ship wrapped in electrical cables, with generators humming and equipment sparking, might have looked like something out of a mad scientist's laboratory. Could witnesses have observed degaussing tests and misunderstood what they were seeing? Could sailors have heard fragments of conversation about Project Rainbow and electromagnetic fields and filled in the gaps with speculation? It's possible. Human memory is remarkably unreliable, especially when recalling events from decades earlier. Our brains are pattern-seeking instruments, constantly trying to create coherent narratives from fragmentary information. But the Navy's blanket denials make it difficult to separate truth from fiction. By refusing to acknowledge even the mundane explanations, by maintaining that nothing unusual happened aboard the Eldridge or any other ship, officials inadvertently feed the conspiracy. A more nuanced response might have diffused the legend. Yes, we conducted electromagnetic research during the war. Yes, there were classified projects involving destroyer escorts. No, none of them involved invisibility or teleportation. Here are the declassified records of what we actually did. Instead, the simple denial invites disbelief. It sounds too absolute, too certain. The military's actual track record of secrecy and deception makes such categorical statements impossible to accept at face value. The deck logs that prove the Eldridge's location face their own credibility problems. While the official records show the ship was nowhere near Philadelphia in October of 1943, believers point out that logs can be falsified. Documents can be created after the fact. If the military was willing to hide the Manhattan Project and Operation Paperclip, why wouldn't they alter a ship's war diary? This is the fundamental problem with official denials in the face of a culture trained by real conspiracies. Once trust is broken, once it's proven that the government will lie about secret projects and maintain those lies for generations, every denial becomes suspect. The Navy's insistence that the Philadelphia experiment never occurred carries no more weight than their earlier insistence that they weren't bringing Nazi scientists to America. Both statements might be true, but the institution making them has lost the credibility needed to be taken at their word. The human imagination has always been drawn to the impossible, but few legends have demonstrated the remarkable staying power of the Philadelphia experiment. For 8 decades now, this story has captivated minds across generations, surviving wave after wave of debunking, resisting countless exposures of its fabricated origins, and adapting itself to each new technological age. Understanding why this particular tale has endured tells us less about naval experiments and more about the deep psychological needs that conspiracy theories fulfill in the human psyche. At its core, the Philadelphia experiment taps into one of humanity's oldest and most persistent fantasies: the power of invisibility. Long before Carlos Allende spun his elaborate fiction, cultures worldwide had dreamed of vanishing from sight. Ancient Greek mythology gave us the cap of Hades that rendered Perseus invisible. Medieval alchemists sought elixirs of transparency. Folk tales from every continent feature cloaks, rings, or spells that grant the wearer the ultimate power to observe without being observed, to move through the world unseen and unchallenged. This fantasy speaks to fundamental human desires for privacy, safety, and control. To be invisible is to possess godlike power over one's environment, to transcend the vulnerabilities of the physical body, to become untouchable. When we translate this ancient fantasy into the 20th century context of military technology, it becomes even more potent. The idea of an invisible warship represents not just tactical advantage, but absolute dominance. Imagine a destroyer that could pass through enemy waters undetected, striking anywhere without warning, impervious to counterattack. In an era when naval superiority determined global power, such a capability would fundamentally alter the balance of world affairs. The Philadelphia experiment legend emerged during World War II, when the stakes of technological supremacy could not have been higher. Every advance in radar, sonar, or weapons systems potentially tipped the scales toward victory or defeat. Against this backdrop, the notion that the United States Navy might be pursuing invisibility technology did not seem absurd. It seemed inevitable. The timing of the legend's emergence and growth cannot be separated from the profound anxieties of the post-war era. When Morris Jessup received those first letters from Carlos Allende in the mid-1950s, America was grappling with a new and terrifying reality. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had demonstrated that science could now create weapons of absolute destruction. The Cold War arms race was accelerating. Nuclear tests were showering invisible radiation across testing sites and downwind communities. The government was conducting classified experiments on everything from biological weapons to mind control. Project MK-Ultra, the radiation experiments on unwitting citizens, the Tuskegee syphilis study. These genuine conspiracies would eventually come to light, validating the suspicion that authorities were indeed conducting secret programs that sacrificed individual welfare for national security goals. In this climate of legitimate concern, mixed with existential dread, the Philadelphia experiment found extraordinarily fertile ground. It combined cutting-edge physics that few people understood with secretive military applications and catastrophic human costs. It suggested that the same scientific establishment that had unleashed atomic fire might have opened other dangerous doors, perhaps tampering with forces even more fundamental than nuclear fission. The story's dark outcome: sailors fused into metal, men driven insane, Crew members vanishing into thin air served as a cautionary tale about unchecked technological ambition. It expressed in narrative form what many Americans felt but could not articulate: that science had progressed beyond human wisdom to control it, that their own government might sacrifice them in pursuit of weapons supremacy, that reality itself had become unstable and untrustworthy. The psychological mechanisms that sustain conspiracy theories like the Philadelphia experiment are well understood by researchers who study human cognition. Our brains are pattern recognition machines, evolved to detect meaningful connections in complex environments. This ability served our ancestors well when identifying which plants were edible or which rustling grass might conceal a predator. But this same capability can misfire, leading us to perceive patterns and connections where none exist. Psychologists call this apophenia, the tendency to see significance in random data. When we encounter the Philadelphia experiment story, our pattern-seeking minds begin connecting dots. Einstein's unified field theory, degaussing experiments, reports of strange phenomena, government secrecy. Each element seems to confirm the others, building an interlocking structure that feels more solid than it actually is. Confirmation bias amplifies this effect powerfully. Once we encounter a compelling narrative, we unconsciously begin filtering information to support it. Evidence that confirms the story receives attention and credence. Contradictory information gets dismissed or explained away. Someone intrigued by the Philadelphia experiment might seize upon ambiguous photographs, vague military documents, or coincidental timing as proof, while ignoring the complete absence of physical evidence, the contradictions in witness accounts, or the exposed frauds at the story's origin. The human mind becomes invested in the narrative it has accepted, and admitting error feels like personal defeat rather than intellectual honesty. Perhaps most seductive is what researchers call the appeal of secret knowledge. Believing in the Philadelphia experiment places the believer among an enlightened minority who have seen through official deceptions. This provides a sense of empowerment and special status. In a complex world where most of us feel powerless before large institutions and impersonal forces, they replace feelings of helplessness with feelings of insight. The believer becomes a detective, an investigator uncovering hidden truths that authorities desperately want to suppress. This psychological reward is significant enough that many people will maintain belief even when confronted with overwhelming, contradictory evidence. The question of false memories adds another layer to understanding the Philadelphia experiment's persistence. Several individuals over the years have claimed direct involvement in the alleged experiment, describing in vivid detail their experiences aboard the USS Eldridge or witnessing its disappearance. How can we explain these seemingly sincere testimonies when no such experiment occurred? Memory researchers have demonstrated repeatedly that human memory is far more malleable and unreliable than most people assume. We do not record experiences like a video camera. Instead, we reconstruct memories each time we recall them, and in that reconstruction process, new information can be incorporated, details can shift, and entirely false memories can be created. Veterans of World War II experienced profound trauma and stress that could significantly affect memory formation and recall. Combat veterans often struggle with fragmented memories, intrusive recollections, and difficulty distinguishing between actual experiences and nightmares or dreams from the wartime period. A sailor who served in the Navy during the 1940s and later encountered the Philadelphia experiment story might unconsciously begin incorporating elements of that narrative into his own genuine but fragmentary memories of degaussing tests, electrical experiments, or other classified activities he witnessed. Over time, with repeated telling and social reinforcement from believers, these blended memories could become subjectively indistinguishable from genuine recall. Clinical psychologists have documented cases where individuals develop elaborate false memories of experiences that never occurred, sometimes through suggestive questioning, sometimes through exposure to compelling narratives, sometimes through the brain's attempt to fill gaps in actual memory. A veteran might genuinely remember something unusual happening aboard a naval vessel, some experiment or test that was classified or simply not explained to enlisted men. Decades later, encountering the Philadelphia experiment story, his mind might retroactively interpret those fragmentary genuine memories through the lens of the legend, creating what feels like a complete and accurate recollection of an event that never happened. The emotion and conviction with which such witnesses tell their stories does not indicate deception. They may truly believe they are reporting actual experiences. The 1984 Hollywood film, The Philadelphia Experiment, represents a crucial turning point in the legend's evolution. Before the movie, the story circulated primarily among UFO enthusiasts and conspiracy theorists who read specialized publications and attended fringe conferences. The film brought the legend to mainstream audiences, packaging it in an entertaining narrative that took creative liberties with the already fictional source material. Millions of people who would never read Morris Jessup's books or seek out conspiracy literature encountered a version of the Philadelphia Experiment in their local theaters. For many viewers, the film became their primary reference point for the story, replacing the more complicated and contradictory earlier versions with a streamlined Hollywood narrative. This cultural amplification through popular media fundamentally changed the legend's nature and reach. The film added romantic elements, updated the timeline to create a time travel plot, and created sympathetic characters for audiences to identify with. These additions had nothing to do with the original Allende Letters, but they made the story more emotionally engaging and memorable. Subsequent generations discovering the Philadelphia Experiment often encountered the movie first, then worked backward to the purported historical basis, their understanding forever shaped by Hollywood's interpretation. The film spawned a sequel, inspired countless documentaries and television episodes, and established visual imagery that would define the legend for new audiences. Popular culture's role in sustaining and evolving conspiracy theories cannot be overstated. Television shows like The X-Files or Fringe have repeatedly mined the Philadelphia Experiment for plot elements, each iteration adding new layers and introducing the core concept to fresh audiences. Video games, novels, comic books, and internet creations have all contributed variations on the theme, keeping the legend alive and mutable. Each retelling slightly alters details, emphasizes different aspects, or combines the Philadelphia Experiment with other conspiracy theories, creating an ever-expanding mythology that becomes increasingly detached from any historical reality. The legend persists today precisely because it serves multiple psychological and cultural functions simultaneously. It expresses anxieties about technology outpacing human control. It validates suspicions about government secrecy and institutional dishonesty. It provides the intellectual satisfaction of pattern recognition and the emotional reward of possessing special knowledge. It connects believers to a community of like-minded individuals who reinforce each other's convictions. And perhaps most fundamentally, it reminds us that despite our scientific advances and rational frameworks, we still crave mystery, still hunger for the extraordinary, still want to believe that reality contains hidden dimensions beyond the mundane world of our daily experience. Understanding why the Philadelphia Experiment endures does not require believing the story is true. It requires recognizing what the story does for those who believe it, what psychological needs it fulfills, what cultural anxieties it expresses. The legend survives not because the evidence supports it, but because the human mind is drawn to narratives that make the chaotic world feel more meaningful, that transform random tragedy into purposeful conspiracy, that suggest hidden powers and secret knowledge waiting to be discovered. In this sense, the Philadelphia Experiment will likely persist for decades to come, continually adapting to new technologies and new anxieties, forever promising that beneath the surface of official reality, something extraordinary is waiting to be revealed. In the decades following Morris Jessup's tragic death and the circulation of the mysterious Allende Letters, the Philadelphia Experiment transformed from a fringe naval conspiracy into a cultural phenomenon that would demand serious investigation. By the 1980s and 90s, a new generation of researchers emerged, armed with Freedom of Information Act requests, Naval Archives access, and a determination to finally separate fact from fiction. What they discovered would both illuminate and complicate the mystery in equal measure. Among the first serious skeptical investigators was Robert Gorman, a researcher who became fascinated with the Allende Letters in the late 1970s. Unlike previous investigators who accepted the letters at face value or dismissed them entirely, Gorman took a methodical approach. He began tracing the origins of Carlos Miguel Allende, the mysterious correspondent whose rambling notes to Morris Jessup had started everything. What Gorman discovered was remarkable in its mundanity. Through patient investigation, he identified Allende as Carl Meredith Allen, a man with a documented history of mental health struggles and a tendency toward elaborate storytelling. Gorman tracked down Allen in the early 1980s and even obtained an interview. Allen admitted to fabricating portions of the story, claimed he had drawn from various science fiction sources and misunderstood scientific concepts, yet curiously maintained that some core elements remained true. This partial confession left investigators in an uncomfortable middle ground. Was the entire Philadelphia experiment based on the fantasies of a troubled man? Or had Allen embellished a genuine event he had somehow witnessed? Naval historians approached the mystery from a different angle, focusing on the USS Eldridge itself. Researchers like Jacques Vallée and Lieutenant Commander George Hoover began meticulously reconstructing the destroyer escort's actual movements during 1943. What they found seemed to definitively disprove the core story. Naval records showed the USS Eldridge was commissioned on August 27, 1943, at the New York Navy Yard. Throughout the autumn of 1943, the period when the Philadelphia experiment supposedly occurred, the ship's deck logs placed it nowhere near Philadelphia. Instead, the Eldridge conducted sea trials in the Bahamas and Long Island Sound before departing for North Africa in early 1944. The ship never docked in Philadelphia during the critical time frame. These records appeared conclusive, archived in multiple locations, and corroborated by crew rosters and supply requisitions. Yet believers countered with a troubling question. If the Navy wanted to hide evidence of a secret experiment, wouldn't falsifying or substituting deck logs be the first and most obvious step? This debate intensified when researchers attempted to locate actual crew members from the USS Eldridge. The official military personnel file system should have made this straightforward, but investigators encountered strange obstacles. Some crew members listed on rosters seemed to have no other service record. Others could be located but flatly denied anything unusual occurred. A few admitted strange events, but described them in conventional terms: unusual equipment malfunctions, a fire that caused disorientation, perhaps an accidental electrical incident. None corroborated the dramatic invisibility and teleportation described in the Allende Letters. However, investigators noted something peculiar. Several sailors who served on destroyer escorts in the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard during 1943 reported witnessing something extraordinary involving a different ship, though details remained maddeningly vague. These witnesses described seeing a vessel surrounded by strange green fog or light, sailors who seemed confused or traumatized, and rumors that circulated through the shipyard about an experiment gone wrong. Were these witnesses remembering the USS Eldridge under a different name, conflating multiple incidents, or describing an entirely separate event? The complexity of verification deepened when researchers examined the scientific plausibility of the alleged experiment. Physicists and engineers who studied the claims identified a genuine historical basis that lent unexpected credibility to aspects of the story. During World War II, the Navy did conduct experiments involving degaussing, a real technique for making ships less visible to magnetic mines. Degaussing involved running electrical cables around a ship's hull to neutralize its magnetic signature. This process could create unusual electromagnetic fields, produce strange visual effects in certain atmospheric conditions, and potentially cause disorientation among crew members unfamiliar with the phenomenon. Some researchers theorized that a degaussing experiment, possibly combined with other electronic warfare testing, could have been misunderstood or exaggerated into the invisibility legend. This explanation accounted for electromagnetic elements of the story, while remaining within known physics. However, it failed to address the more exotic claims: teleportation between Philadelphia and Norfolk, sailors phasing through walls, or men frozen in time within the ship's bulkheads. Then, in 1984, the Philadelphia experiment narrative exploded into bizarre new dimensions with the emergence of Al Bielek, a man claiming to be born as Edward Cameron. Bielek stated he was one of two brothers who participated in the Philadelphia experiment as scientific officers. His story represented an extraordinary evolution of the legend, incorporating elements that transformed it from a simple invisibility test into something far stranger. According to Bielek, during the experiment, he and his brother Duncan jumped from the USS Eldridge while it was trapped in hyperspace. They landed not in the water but in the year 1983 at Montauk Point, Long Island, where they became unwilling participants in another secret project called the Montauk Project. This alleged operation involved time travel, mind control, and interdimensional experiments. After years at Montauk, Bielek claimed the government altered his memories and gave him a new identity as Al Bielek. But in the 1980s, his original memories began returning through a process he called spontaneous recall. Bielek's accounts fascinated and troubled investigators in equal measure. Unlike earlier Philadelphia experiment witnesses who remained shadowy or anonymous, Bielek eagerly sought publicity, appearing at conferences, giving lectures, and submitting to lengthy interviews. He provided elaborate technical details about the experiment's methodology, naming specific scientists involved, including John von Neumann and Nikola Tesla. He described the ship's equipment configuration, the electromagnetic field generators used, and the catastrophic effects on the crew when the experiment went beyond its parameters. His descriptions possessed internal consistency and technical sophistication that impressed some listeners. Bielek could discuss theoretical physics, electromagnetic field theory, and time-space distortion with apparent fluency. He connected the Philadelphia experiment to broader alleged programs of government experimentation, creating a complex narrative that explained why evidence remained scarce. A vast conspiracy specifically designed to suppress the truth. Skeptical researchers quickly identified serious problems with Bielek's claims. Investigators discovered that Al Bielek's documented history showed no gap where his supposed time at Montauk might have occurred. Birth records, school transcripts, and employment histories for Al Bielek existed continuously from the 1920s onward, contradicting his claim of being born as Edward Cameron in 1916. Moreover, photographs of Bielek as a young man bore no resemblance to the age-progressed images of what Edward Cameron would have looked like. When confronted with these inconsistencies, Bielek explained them as evidence of the conspiracy's sophistication. The government had created an entirely false documentary history for his Al Bielek identity. This explanation was unfalsifiable, a characteristic that skeptical investigators recognized as a hallmark of pseudoscientific claims. No evidence could disprove Bielek's story because any contradictory evidence was simply absorbed into the conspiracy narrative. Psychological researchers studying Bielek noted patterns consistent with confabulation, a process where individuals create detailed false memories, often believing them completely. The gradual recovery of memories that Bielek described paralleled known cases of false memory syndrome, particularly those influenced by hypnotic regression or suggestive therapeutic techniques. Bielek acknowledged using various methods to recover his suppressed memories, including techniques that memory researchers recognized as highly likely to produce false recollection. Yet Bielek's believers pointed to the emotional authenticity of his accounts. In interviews, he displayed genuine distress when describing traumatic aspects of his supposed experiences. Crew members going insane, sailors fused into the ship's structure, the horror of being displaced in time. His consistency across hundreds of hours of recorded testimony impressed supporters who argued that such elaborate fabrication would be nearly impossible to maintain. The Bielek phenomenon revealed how the Philadelphia experiment legend had evolved beyond its origins. What began as a possible misunderstanding of degaussing experiments, or a complete fabrication in the Allende Letters, had grown into an elaborate mythology incorporating time travel, parallel government projects, and consciousness manipulation. Investigators noted this pattern commonly occurred with conspiracy theories. Each generation added new layers connecting previously separate mysteries into increasingly complex meta-narratives. The Philadelphia experiment became linked to Area 51st, the Roswell incident, and various alleged mind control programs. These connections made the story more appealing to certain audiences, but simultaneously more difficult to investigate seriously. Meanwhile, other researchers continued pursuing more conventional evidence. Naval historian Jan Sammer devoted years to interviewing every surviving crew member of the USS Eldridge she could locate. Her systematic approach yielded interviews with more than 40 veterans who served on the ship at various points during World War II. Not one corroborated the invisibility experiment. Most expressed frustration that their vessel had become associated with what they considered nonsense, feeling it dishonored their legitimate service. Several crew members described the USS Eldridge as a thoroughly ordinary destroyer escort that performed unremarkable convoy duty. Yet Sammer noted that none of her interviewees served during the specific October 1943 timeframe when the experiment allegedly occurred. The sailors aboard during that period remained conspicuously absent from veteran registries and reunion associations. Whether this absence indicated something sinister or simply reflected incomplete record-keeping remained unclear. The authenticity examination of the Allende letters themselves produced mixed results. Forensic document analysts studied the original letters held by the Office of Naval Research. The paper and ink dated correctly to the 1950s, eliminating the possibility of modern forgery. Handwriting analysis confirmed consistency across the multiple letters, supporting their origin from a single author. However, linguistic analysis revealed something interesting. The writing style shifted between sections, alternating between crude, barely literate passages and segments displaying sophisticated knowledge of physics terminology. This inconsistency suggested either multiple authors, a single author with fragmented thinking, or someone deliberately crafting a hoax by alternating between personas. The annotations found in Morris Jessup's copy of the case for the UFO showed similar patterns, adding weight to the theory that Carl Allende possessed genuine knowledge of certain subjects while fabricating or misunderstanding others. What emerged from decades of investigation was a frustrating ambiguity. Serious researchers accumulated substantial evidence against the Philadelphia experiment, as described in popular accounts. The USS Eldridge's documented location during the alleged experiment timeframe, the lack of corroborating crew testimony, and the admitted fabrications by Carl Allende all argued against the story's literal truth. Yet troubling gaps remained. The Navy's documented interest in the Allende Letters, evidenced by the Office of Naval Research's unusual decision to reproduce and circulate them, suggested something about the claims merited attention. The persistent rumors among Philadelphia naval shipyard workers about secret experiments, though vague and unspecific, indicated something unusual might have occurred, even if not matching the dramatic descriptions. The strange reluctance of certain officials to discuss the matter, often hiding behind national security classifications that remained in effect decades after World War II ended, struck some investigators as excessive for a simple hoax. The Philadelphia experiment case demonstrated the profound difficulty of proving a negative, especially concerning alleged classified military operations. Skeptics could show the popular story was almost certainly false, but believers could always retreat to unfalsifiable positions. Records were altered, witnesses were silenced, the actual experiment occurred on a different ship or at a different time. This dynamic created a permanent stalemate where definitive proof remained perpetually out of reach, leaving the mystery suspended between debunking and belief, between documented history and impossible legend. The Philadelphia experiment never happened. At least, not in the way the legend tells it. No destroyer vanished into thin air in 1943. No sailors fused with steel bulkheads. No men burst into flames or fell through solid decks, screaming. The evidence is overwhelming, the debunking thorough, the official denials consistent. And yet, the story refuses to die, passed from generation to generation, adapted and reimagined, woven into our cultural fabric as firmly as any verified historical event. Perhaps that persistence itself is worth examining. Perhaps what the Philadelphia experiment reveals about us matters more than whether it actually occurred. The legend endures because it speaks to something true, even if the event itself was fiction. It gives form to anxieties that are very real, very justified, and rooted in documented history. We fear unchecked scientific experimentation because scientists have conducted unchecked experiments. We distrust government assurances because governments have lied. We suspect that classified projects hide horrors because classified projects have hidden horrors. The Philadelphia experiment may be mythology, but the world that made such mythology necessary is disturbingly factual. Consider what we know actually happened, not in legend but in verified history. Between 1944 and 1974, the United States government conducted radiation experiments on unwitting civilians, injecting patients with plutonium without their knowledge or consent. Project MKUltra, the CIA's mind control program, dosed thousands with LSD and other drugs, destroyed lives, and erased records to hide the evidence. The Tuskegee syphilis study observed black men dying of a treatable disease for 40 years, withholding penicillin to study the disease's progression. These are not conspiracy theories. These are documented facts, some only revealed decades after they occurred, many only discovered because of persistent journalists and whistleblowers who refused to accept official denials. When the Navy says the Philadelphia experiment never happened, they're almost certainly telling the truth. But when citizens respond with skepticism, when people suspect there might be something hidden in classified archives, when the public doubts official reassurances, that skepticism is earned. It's been purchased with thousands of lives damaged or destroyed by secret programs that official spokespeople once denied just as firmly as they deny the Philadelphia experiment today. The legend may be false, but the distrust that keeps it alive is entirely rational. This creates a genuine dilemma for anyone trying to separate truth from fiction. How do we maintain healthy skepticism about government secrecy without tumbling into the bottomless pit of unfounded conspiracy? How do we acknowledge that some suspicions are justified without concluding that every suspicion must be true? The Philadelphia experiment sits precisely on this uncomfortable boundary. It asks us to trust institutions that have proven untrustworthy, even as we recognize that not every denial is a lie. The modern parallels are impossible to ignore. Right now, at this very moment, military projects are underway that we know nothing about. Black budget programs consume billions of dollars with minimal oversight. Classified research continues at facilities we cannot visit, studying technologies we can only imagine. Some of this work is mundane, incremental improvements to existing systems. Some of it is undoubtedly extraordinary. And decades from now, some of it will be declassified, and we will learn what today's scientists were actually doing in today's secret laboratories. What legends will tomorrow's generations tell about today's classified programs? What stories will emerge when our current experiments finally come to light? The technology has advanced far beyond anything the 1940s could imagine. We have quantum computers, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, directed energy weapons, autonomous drones. We have the capability to surveil entire populations, to manipulate information on unprecedented scales, to develop weapons that would seem like magic to earlier generations. What happens when that technology meets the same culture of secrecy, the same lack of oversight, the same willingness to prioritize results over ethics that characterized mid-century military research? Perhaps in 2080, people will tell stories about experiments conducted in 2020. Perhaps they'll speak of AI programs that gained unexpected capabilities, of genetic modifications with unforeseen consequences, of quantum experiments that touched something they shouldn't have touched. Perhaps those stories will be exaggerations, distortions, complete fabrications built around kernels of classified truth. Perhaps future debunkers will patiently explain that no, the AI didn't actually become conscious, the modifications didn't create what the legends claim, the quantum experiments didn't open doorways to other dimensions. And perhaps those future skeptics will be correct in their debunking, while still missing the larger point, just as modern debunkers of the Philadelphia experiment are correct about the facts while sometimes missing the deeper truth the legend represents. The concept of invisibility runs through this entire story, but not in the way the legend suggests. The real invisibility isn't about ships disappearing from radar or men facing through walls. The real invisibility is more insidious and more tragic. There are invisible victims of experimentation, people harmed by secret programs whose suffering goes unacknowledged because the programs themselves remain classified. There are invisible truths buried in archives that won't be opened for decades, facts that would change our understanding of history if we could access them. There is an invisible line between healthy skepticism and destructive paranoia, and we cannot see it clearly because the very institutions we need to trust have repeatedly proven themselves untrustworthy. Think about the sailors who actually served on the USS Eldridge, the real men whose real service has been overshadowed by a legend they had nothing to do with. Think about Carlos Allende, whose troubled mind generated a story that took on a life far beyond his control. Think about the researchers at the Office of Naval Research who have spent decades patiently denying an experiment that never occurred, knowing that each denial will be taken by some as further proof of the cover-up. Think about the genuine military researchers whose classified work, whatever it actually involves, will someday be declassified and potentially misunderstood, distorted, transformed into legends that bear little resemblance to reality. The Philadelphia experiment asks us to sit with uncertainty, to accept that some questions may never be fully answered, that some archives may never be opened, that some denials might be true while others are lies, and we may never know which is which. It asks us to maintain skepticism without surrendering to cynicism, to demand transparency while acknowledging that some secrecy may be necessary, to trust but verify in a world where verification is often impossible. These are not comfortable positions. They require holding contradictory ideas simultaneously, living with ambiguity, accepting that the complete truth may remain forever beyond our reach. What remains hidden in the shadows of official history? What experiments are happening now that we won't learn about for 50 years? What truths are locked in classified archives, waiting for future generations to discover? What lies are we being told today that we'll only recognize as lies tomorrow? These questions have no easy answers. The Philadelphia experiment, in all its fictional glory, doesn't provide answers either. But it asks the right questions. It reminds us to remain vigilant, to demand accountability, to question official narratives, while avoiding the trap of rejecting all official information. It warns us that the line between legitimate secrecy and dangerous cover-up is real, invisible, and constantly shifting. The legend endures not because people are gullible, but because the world has given them every reason to believe that impossible-sounding stories sometimes turn out to be true, that official denials sometimes hide actual secrets, that the truth can remain hidden for decades before finally emerging. The Philadelphia experiment is almost certainly fiction, but in a world where Project Malhotra was real, where radiation experiments on civilians actually happened, where government agencies genuinely did conduct horrific research in secret, who can blame anyone for wondering what else might be true? The real mystery isn't what happened in 1943. The real mystery is what's happening now, in classified facilities around the world, creating the legends that future generations will debate just as we debate the Philadelphia experiment today. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this.